Good morning, students. Today's topic is classical theory. This topic's objectives are at the end of this class, students will be able to understand the precipitate. First is classical, new classical, and modern theories of organization. Next is the research organization as a social system. Next objective, the importance of and process for goal setting in an organization. Next, the need for the methods of integration in an organization. And next, the concept of power in an organization. Next objective is communication in the organization. And the last objective is the process and models of decision making. And this topic's introduction is the classical theory is the traditional theory, wherein more emphasis is on the organization rather than the employees working therein. According to the classical theory, the organization is considered as a machine and the human beings as different components, parts of that machine. And next is the classical theory of concepts. What is the classical theory? The classical theory of concept is one of the five primary theories of concepts, the other four being prototype or exemplar theories, automatic theories, and new classical theories. The classical theory implies that every complex concept has a classical analysis, where a classical analysis of a concept is a proportion giving metaphysically necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for being in the extension across possible worlds for that concept. And this concept known that is a classical analysis for a complex concept. C. C gives a set of individually necessary conditions for being a C that together are sufficient for being a C. The classical view also goes by the name of the differential view of concepts or definitionism, where a definition of a concept is given in terms of necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. And next is the classical theory has the following characteristics. First is it is built on an accounting model. Next, it lays emphasis on detecting errors and correcting them once they have been committed. It is more concerned with the amount of output than the human beings. The human beings are considered to be relatively homogeneous and unmodifiable. Thus, labor is not divided on the basis of different kinds of jobs to be performed in an organization. It is assumed that employees are relatively stable in terms of the change in an organization. It is assumed that the authority and control should be vested with the central authority only. In order to have a centralized and integrated system, some writer of classical theory emphasized on the technological aspects of the organization and how the individuals can be made more efficient while others emphasized on the structural aspects of an organization so that individuals collectively can be made more efficient. Thus, this pu- peer review of different writers resulted in the formation of two district stream. Two district streams are scientific management stream, administrative management stream. Thus, according to this theory, the human beings are just considered as a means of production. And next is organization theory. This theory called organization theory and explain what kind of organization structure can be more effective in achieving organization. Objectives are study organization as a whole, study design and structure of organization. Next is classical theory. Classical theory is formal organization. That is organization. Organization means machine. And departments mean in these organizations many departments. And departments means components. And people are means to produce product. And next is standardized. Standardized means the organization what's standard or what is the standard the organization division of labor, span of control, departmentation, and unity of command. And the last is delegation of authority. These are the formal organization points. And next, because of its approach to human being, it is also called mechanistic structure. In mechanistic structure, it ignores the social aspects of employees. And this is the fundamental principles of the classical theory is that the economy is self-regulating. Classical economists maintain that the economy is always capable of achieving the natural level of real GDP or output, which is the level of real GDP. That is obtained when the economy's resources are fully employed. And next, the for what is the question arises in what is the classical economics? Classical economics is a broad term that refers to the dominant school of thought for economics in the 18th and 19th centuries. Most consider Scottish economist Adam Smith the progenitor of classical economic theory. However, Spanish scholars, scholastics and French pious oratists made earlier contributions. Other notable contributions to classical economics include David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, Annie Robert, Jacques Turgot, John Stratus Mills, Jean Baptiste Say, and Eugene Bohm von Bever. There is the classical economics, and understanding classical economics are self-regulating democracies and capitalist market developments from form the basis for classical economics. Before the rise of classical economics, most national economy followed a top-down command and control matter-rich government policy system. Many of the most famous classical thinkers, including Smith and Turgot, developed their theories as alternative to the protectionist and inflationary policies of mercantist Europe. Classical economics become closely associated with economic and literal political freedom. And next is The while custom circumstances arises from time to time that cause the economy to fall below or to exceed the natural level of real GDP. Self adjustment mechanism exist within the market system that work to bring the economy back to the natural level of real GDP. The classical doctrine that the economy is always at or near the natural level of real GDP is based on two firmly held beliefs, says law, and the belief that prices, wages, and interest rates are flexible. And says laws, according to says laws, when an economy product, produce a certain level of real GDP, it also generates the income needed to purchase that level of real GDP. In other words, the economy is always capable of demanding all of the output that its workers and firms choose to produce. Hence, the economy is always capable of achieving the natural level of real GDP. And next, the achievement of the natural level of real GDP is not as simple as says law would seem to suggest. While it is true that the income obtained from producing a certain level of real GDP must be sufficient to purchase that level of real GDP, there is no guarantee that all of this income will be spent. And some of this income will be saved. Income that is saved is not used to purchase consumption, goods, and services, implying that the demand for these goods and services will be less than the supply. If aggregate demand falls below aggregate supply due to aggregate saving, suppliers will cut back on their production and reduce the number of resources that they employ. And when employment of the economy resources falls below the full employment level, the equilibrium level of real GDP, also falls below its natural level. Consequently, the economy may not achieve the natural level of real GDP if there is aggregate saving and the rise of classical economics. What is the rise of classical economy? Classical economic theory was developed shortly after the birth of Western capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. Classical economics provided the best early attempts at explaining capitalism inner workings. The earliest classical economists developed theories of value, price, supply, demand, and distribution. Nearly all rejected government interference with market exchanges, preferring a looser market strategies known as laissez faire or let it be. Classical thinkers were not completely ununified in their beliefs or our understanding of markets, although there were notable common themes in most classical literature. The majority favored free trade and competition among workers and businesses. Classical economists wanted to transition away from class based social structure in favor of meritorious and the decline of classical economics. The classical economics of Adam Smith had drastically involved that changed by the 1880s and 1890s, but its core remained intact by the time. By that time, the writings of German philosopher Karl Marx had emerged to challenges the policy preoccupations of the classical school. However, Marx's economics made very few lasting contributions to economic theory. A more thorough challenge to classical theory emerged in the 1930s and 1940s through the writings of British mathematician John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was a student to Alfred Marshall and admirer of Thomas Malthus. Keynes thought that free market economies tended toward underconsumption of underspending. He called this the crucial economic problem and used it to criticize high interest rate and individual performance for saving. Keynes also refuted Say's law of markets. Keynesian economists advocated for a more controlling role for central governments in economic affairs, which made Keynes popular with British and American politicians. After the Great Depression and World War II, Keynesianism had replaced classical and neoclassical economies as the dominant intellectual paradigm among world governments. And the real world example, Adam Smith 1776 release of the Wealth of Nations highlights some of the most prominent developments in classical economies. His revelations centered around the free trades and a concept called the invisible hand, which served as the theory for the beginning stages of domestic and international supply and demand. This theory, the dual and completing force of demand side and sale side, moves the market to price and production equilibrium. Smith's studies help promote domestic trade and led to more efficient and rational pricing in the product markets based on supply and demand. And this is the real example of the real world example. And next, the classical theorists' response is that the funds from aggregate saving are even actually borrowed and turned into investment expenditures, more which are a component of a real GDP. Hence, aggregate saving need not lead to a reduction in real GDP. Next is consider however what happens when the funds from aggregate saving exceed the needs of all borrowers in the economy. In this situation, real GDP will fall below its natural level because investment expenditures will be less than the level of aggregate saving. This situations is illustrated in this picture. In this figure, the this line show interest rate, and this is the aggregate saving or aggregate investment, and this aggregate saving represented by the curve S is an upward sloping function of the interest rate. As the investment interest rate rise, the economy trends to save more. And aggregate investment represented by the curve L I is a downward sloping function of the interest rate as the interest rate rise. The cost of borrowing increasing and investment expenditure decline. In next, initially, aggregate saving and investment are equivalent at the interest rate. Interest rate I. If aggregate saving were to increase, causing the S curve to shift to the right to S dash, then at the same interest rate I, a gap emerges between investment and saving. Aggregate investment will be lower than aggregate saving, implying that equilibrium real GDP will be below its natural level. And this is the flexible interest rates, wages, and price. Classical economists believe that under these circumstances, the interest rate will fall, causing investors to demand more of the available saving. In fact, the interest rate will fall for enough from I to I dash. In figure, to make the supply of funds from aggregate saving equal to the demand for funds by the investors. And next, hence, an increases in savings will lead to an increase in investment expenditures through a reduction of the interest rate, and the economy will always return to the natural level of real GDP. The flexibility of the interest rate as well as other prices is the self adjusting. mechanism of the classical theory that ensure that real GDP is always at its natural level. And this is the similarly flexibility of the wage rate keeps the labor market in labor market or the market of workers in equilibrium all the time. If the supply of workers exceeds firms' demand for workers, then wages paid to workers will fall so as to ensure that the workforce is fully employed. And this as the fully employed and the classical economists believe that any unemployment that occurs in the labor market or in resource markets should be considered voluntary unemployment. Voluntarily unemployment unemployed workers are unemployed because they refuse to accept lower wages. If they would only accept lower wages, firms would be eager to employ them. In graphical illustration of the classical theory as it relates to a decrease in aggregate demand, figure considers a decrease in aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. And this is the picture. Classical theory of output and price level adjustment during a recession and the immediate short run effect is that the economy moves down along the SAS curve. This is the SAS curve. And labor causing the equilibrium cause the equilibrium price level to fall from P1. This is the price level and this is the real GDP. The price level is low. P1 to P2, P3. This is the lower price. Fall down the price. And equilibrium real GDP to fall below its natural level of Y. The fall below natural level of Y. And Y1 to Y2 2. And economies, workers and resources are not being fully employed. And this picture, when there are unemployed resources, the classical theory predicts that the wages paid to these resources will fall. With the fall in wages, supplier will be able to supply more goods to lower cost. This the lower cost in suppliers high, more goods supply. In this causing the SAS curve to shift to the right from SA1 to SA2. The end result is that the equilibrium price level fall to P1, but the economy return to the natural level of real GDP is Y2. This is the economy return to the natural level of real GDP. And this end of the topic, what is the classical growth theory? And classical growth theory, classical is a modern category of economic theory that is applied to the work of several economists who wrote about the process and sources of economic growth in their time. Roughly, the 18th and 19th century, two important theorists associated with these ideas include Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And this classical theory, understanding classical theory growth, is the classical growth theory was developed alongside the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. Analysis of the process of the economist's growth was a central focus of these classical economists. Classical economists sought to provide an account of the broad forces that influenced economic growth and of the mechanism underlying the growth process. In underlying growth process, the division of labor, the gain from trade, and the accumulation of capital were seen as the main driving forces of economic growth. Productive investment is the and the reinvestment of profits were the mechanism that produced in continuous economic growth. So changes in the rate of profit were a decisive reference point for an analysis of a long term evaluation of the economy. They argue that individual initiative under the freely competitive conditions to promote individual ends would produce beneficial result to society as a whole. Their conclusion supported the ap- adoption of the free trade, respect for private property, and individual free enterprise. Meanwhile, conflicting economic interests could be reconciled by the operation of competitive market forces and the limited activity of responsible government. These economist ideas derived from previous economic ways of thinking. Their critique of feudal society that came before them was based on the observation, among others, that a large portion of the social product was not so well invested but was consumed unproductively by the ruling class. They followed the French psychologists in studying the economic welfare of a nation as a whole, as opposed to mercantilist focus on the accumulation of gold for the king. They split from the psychocrats by focusing on the celebrating industry and capital accumulation as a source of economic prosperity. This is the topic of economic growth. And Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. Scottish economist Adam Smith was the leading figure of the classical theory of growth. Smith wrote that the division of labor among workers into more specialized tasks was the driver of growth in the transition to an individual capitalist economy as the Industrial Revolution mattered. Smith argued that the availability of specialized tools, the equipment would allow workers to further specialize and thereby increase their productivity. In order for this to happen, ongoing capital accumulation was necessary, which depend on the owners of capital being able to keep and reinvest profits from their investments. He explained this process with the metaphor of the invisible hand of profits, which would push capitalists to engage in this process of investment, productivity gains, and reinvestment by seeking their own personal gain and indirectly the benefit of the entire nation. This is the topic, and the end of the topic, the references. are here. These references are help to study or more gain of this topic. And lastly, we discuss about the multiple choice questions. First question is on the basis of government law. The compulsory payment made by the public is known as expenditure, investment, tax, subsidy. The answer is this question is as the what is the answer? And answer is tax. Next is in classical theory, the level of employment is a function of price level, money wage rate, quantity of money, quantity of money, real wage rate. What is classical theory is the answer is real wage rate. And next question is income and employment are determined by total demand, total supply, total demand and total supply both, by market demand. What is the answer? Answer is total demand and total supply both. And next question, the relation between consumption and saving are inverse, direct, inverse and direct both, and neither inverse or neither direct. The answer is inverse. The relation between consumption and saving are inverse relation. Next question is which of the following is not an assumption of classical theory? Neutrality of money, wage price flexibility, involuntary unemployment, long run. The answer is involuntary unemployment. And next question is the classical theory is based on the assumption of a says the law of market, flexibility in wage rate, flexibility in interest rate, all of the above. Answer is all of the above. D is the answer of this question. And next question is in the classical theory, the quality between saving and investment is brought about by first income, rate interest, consumption, none of these. Answer is rate interest. And next question is the real business cycle theory and the new classical theory agree that business cycle are driven by changes in aggregate demand, expectation are formed rationally, in imperfect information plays a big role in business cycles, none of the above. Answer is B. Expectation are formed rationally. And next question is a fall in the price of a commodity leads to a shift in demand, a fall in demand, a rise in the customer's real income, a fall in the customer's real income. The answer is C, a rise in the consumer's real income. And the last question is, which of the following is the better measure of economic development? National income, rural consumption, size of exports, employment. What is the answer? Answer is national income. This is all about the topic, and lastly is thank you